Good morning, dear St. Aldates. When I was 15, my parents assembled my sister, my brother, and me and announced that we were moving. And a guessing game began, each guess suggesting a town further away. And then properly far away. To London? No. To Wales? No. To the Isle of Wight? No. Further? To Ireland, where they were both from and many of our relatives still lived? No. Further. We give up, we said. We're going to Uganda, they said. Our mouths dropped open as this news sank in and the mixture of excitement and panic set in. Excitement because this really, really was an adventure beyond our wildest imaginings, and panic about losing all that was familiar, and most of our school friends. In the end, we didn't lose our school friends because we stayed at school in England and travelled to Uganda for holidays. 4 years after Uganda acquired independence from Britain, my father had taken up a teaching post in a school that was nicknamed the Eton of Uganda, referring to the standard of education rather than the exclusive privilege associated with Eton. And so we were plunged into another culture at a young age. As we travel together through the reaction to and the consequences of George Floyd's death and come to understand how deeply embedded in most of us are strands of racism, I know that colonialism had left all sorts of racist traces in this beautiful country of Uganda, and of course in the school itself. And I'm sure that as a family we displayed racist attitudes that we were completely unaware of. But my parents had always treated everyone who came into our lives with absolute equality. As children, we had no idea that the status of the porter at the school he taught at in England was any different at all from that of the headmaster. Yes, in Uganda we had help at home from a Ugandan, Federico, while we lived there because it was expected. And it was too soon after independence for such structures to have been challenged and dismantled. Federico became one of the family and we loved him. And he loved us. I fell in love with Uganda and her people. And more specifically, I also fell in love with a gorgeous boy in the sixth form and became a mooning teenager. Very annoying, I'm sure. The mooning, I mean, not the fact that he was black. Being in a multicultural setting has been my experience for much of my life. First East Africa, and then our church in Paris, where we had 36 different nations represented, and lived in an arrondissement where every one face in 10 was white. We worked many times in Uganda and often in Togo and Benin in West Africa, and then here in Oxford for the last 20 years or so, though I do admit that Oxford is less immersive. So what, I hear you asking, does all this have to do with Psalm 84? Well, over the last couple of weeks, we've been thinking about this psalm and considered our longings, the deep ones that cause us pain, not the passing longings of the flesh or of acquisition. And we've reflected on the call to be a lifelong pilgrim, finding strength from God for desert times and seasons of suffering by leaning on him. As we come to the third and last reflection on it, I want to think about the verse we know best here. Verse 10, "Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked." I used to think when I read this, but I have lots of really great days elsewhere. I'm not sure I'm ready to trade 1,000 days for just one in church. That seems like a very unequal exchange. But of course, that's not the point, because this verse is about perspective, and we find clean perspective in the presence of God. We're all living through days of enormous confusion about so many things, days of trouble and turmoil, days of opinions being furiously exchanged like so much gunfire in the public square. Where is there to calm down and find perspective that is holy and just? My answer, and the answer here in Psalm 84, is in the presence of God. Of course, all of humanity is perpetually in the presence of God, and we can access his presence anywhere and any time if we want to. This side of the cross, God's Holy Spirit indwells us, and we no longer have to go on a literal pilgrimage to the temple. We don't have to be in church to meet him. And even 5 minutes in God's presence at the start of each day will correct our vision and clarify our perspective. The observant among you will notice that I have new glasses. As I put them on for the first time last week, I was stunned at the difference in my vision, and actually rather ashamed that I'd let my old ones become so worn and damaged that for the last couple of months I've really been struggling to see clearly through them and struggling to read as well. As I put the new ones on for the first time, it was literally like an explosion of light and clarity. In the same way, choosing to spend time in the presence of God gives clarity and often lights up a scene, including things hidden in darkness, with sharp focus, like my new glasses. At the moment, we urgently need clarity to know how to respond to the issue of racial injustice under God's direction. We need to put on spiritual glasses and see, maybe for the first time, our own racism. But we also need to work out together how to address the systemic and structural racism so long embedded in our culture. And the people of God, the church, we, you and I, must be at the forefront of all this. What might God be saying to us about it? So back to Uganda in the 60s and my parents. They were not evangelicals, but they were God-fearers, and they knew and said often that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. They used the Church of England lectionary, and I believe they found the presence of God, which gave them perspective and clarity of vision, which I think and pray and hope was their legacy to us, their children. So better indeed is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. And better to be looking into the temple from the position of a doorkeeper than outside and away, as I believe my parents did, than to spend 1,000 days elsewhere. So God bless you today, and may we find perspective and focus. Bye-bye.